Officer Daniel Stone, a white cop, cruised through the city streets with the air of a man who believed himself untouchable. Years of wielding authority without consequence had cemented his confidence. This was his domain, and he moved through it with the assurance of someone who had never been questioned. The day had been uneventful until a sleek black luxury car sped past him. His eyes narrowed. Instinct, or perhaps something far less justifiable, told him to follow. His fingers flicked the switch, flashing the patrol lights, and the vehicle obediently pulled over. As he approached, his gaze locked onto the driver, a black woman poised and striking, her presence effortlessly commanding. Something about her composure unsettled him. He was used to people wilting under his authority, their fear feeding his control. But she sat still, unmoved, waiting. Daniel rapped on the window, harder than necessary, and she responded with deliberate, unhurried movements, rolling it down to meet his gaze with an unreadable expression. "License and registration," he ordered, his voice clipped, laced with the familiar contempt he didn't bother to mask. She handed over the documents without hesitation, her fingers steady, her face betraying no sign of intimidation. That alone irked him. He expected nervousness, deference, excuses, anything but this calm defiance wrapped in silence. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he pressed, tilting his head as he scrutinized the paperwork longer than needed, searching for something, anything, to justify his scrutiny. Her voice was even, unwavering. "No, I don't. I was within the speed limit." Something about the way she held his gaze, unshaken, made his jaw tighten. He didn't like it. "Nice car," he said after a beat, his lips curving into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Are you sure it's yours?" There it was, the bait, the unspoken accusation wrapped in forced politeness. "Yes," she said simply. "I bought it with my own money." Her tone was controlled, her stare unwavering. There was no anger, no pleading, just certainty. Daniel leaned back slightly, shifting his stance, annoyance creeping into his features. She was supposed to stammer, to justify, to shrink. Instead, she was meeting him where he stood, and he hated it. "Is that so?" he mused, letting his gaze sweep over the car in exaggerated interest. "Didn't realize this neighborhood was getting so many visitors lately." His words dripped with condescension, his meaning clear. The woman didn't flinch. She remained as she was, still, composed, unreadable. Then, with the same quiet certainty, she lifted her chin slightly and replied, "I'm not a visitor. My home is just down that street. I've lived here for 3 years." For the first time, Daniel hesitated. The moment stretched between them, charged and silent. He didn't know it yet, but this encounter would not end as so many others had. Because the woman sitting before him, the one he had just humiliated, the one he had so easily deemed unworthy of this space, was the wife of his new boss. And though she chose not to reveal her identity, she knew with absolute certainty that today, Daniel Stone had made a mistake that would not be ignored. Daniel followed the direction of her nod, but there was nothing, no violation, no justification to prolong the stop. Yet, the simmering anger inside him refused to let go. He leaned against the car, deliberately closing the distance, letting his presence press against her like a shadow. The faint scent of coffee lingered on his breath as he exhaled, his voice low and taunting. "You know," he murmured, tilting his head, "it's easy for someone to make a mistake about a car like this. You understand, right? People like you don't usually drive around here in something this expensive. Maybe you're up to something you shouldn't be." A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes, and for the first time her brow furrowed slightly. But she remained composed, her voice steady, controlled. "People like me?" she repeated, the words deliberate. "And what exactly does that mean?" There was no fear in her question, only quiet defiance. The way she held his gaze made it clear she wasn't playing his game. Daniel smirked, stepping back just enough to give himself the illusion of control. "You know exactly what I mean," he sneered, brushing off the rhetorical challenge. Then, with an air of casual authority, He flipped through her documents again, feigning deep scrutiny. "Let's see. Where do you work? Maybe I should call your employer, see if you're really telling the truth. Wouldn't be the first time I've caught someone spinning stories around here." The woman inhaled slowly, as if steadying herself, as if reining in something beneath the surface. Her tone, when she spoke, was sharp but measured. "I'm an attorney," she said, her voice carrying an unmistakable weight. "Benson and Leon, Main Street." Daniel stiffened. He knew the name, one of the city's most prestigious law firms. His grip on her papers tightened slightly before he forced his fingers to relax. Frustration coiled inside him. She had an answer for everything, and worse, none of his usual tactics seemed to unnerve her. He let out a humorless chuckle. "An attorney, huh?" His voice dripped with disdain. "You must be one of those who defends criminals. Let's see how well you hold up when you're the one under scrutiny." With an exaggerated movement, he lifted his radio to his lips, pretending to call in a background check. "Dispatch, I need verification on—" The words were for show, a performance meant to break her composure, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back slightly, crossing her arms, a flicker of quiet defiance tightening the corners of her mouth. "I've already told you," she said, her voice smooth as steel. "My documents are in order. There's no reason for this stop to continue. I'm willing to cooperate, but I won't accept being treated with disrespect." The directness of her words hit him like a challenge. His jaw clenched. She wasn't playing along, and that burned at something deep within him. "You're bold, aren't you?" He took a step back, his eyes raking over her as though searching for weakness. "I'd watch that attitude if I were you. This might not end well." She met his stare without blinking. "Can I go now?" Her voice, calm but cutting, carried no more patience for this power struggle. Daniel hesitated. For the first time since the stop began, he was unsure. Something about the way she looked at him, unshaken, unmoved, made his chest tighten. For a moment, he considered dragging it out, pushing further, but an unfamiliar discomfort gnawed at him. His fingers flexed against the documents before finally, reluctantly, he handed them back. "Fine," he muttered. "But keep an eye out. We'll be watching. Don't forget where you are, or who I am." She took the papers smoothly, said nothing, and pulled away without hesitation. The sound of her engine hummed through the air as she disappeared down the street, leaving Daniel standing on the curb, watching her taillights fade into the distance. He remained there longer than necessary, something hollow gnawing at his chest. His pulse was faster than it should have been. Why? It had been a routine stop, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet something about that woman unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite grasp. Back in his patrol car, he exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. The echo of her voice lingered in his mind, a quiet but unshakable presence. "I bought it with my money." That night he arrived home later than usual. Sarah was in the living room, curled up with a book, barely glancing up as he walked in. Their marriage had long since settled into silence, neither warm nor hostile, just distant. He had never felt the need to bridge the gap between them, and tonight was no different. Except his mind wasn't here. He didn't know that in another part of the city, the woman he had tried to intimidate was sitting in her own home, recounting every detail of the encounter to her husband. And that her husband, Captain Marcus Lee, his new commanding officer, was already planning the consequences that would soon come crashing down. Morning came, and the city stirred awake. But Daniel Stone had barely slept. Even as he walked into the station, nodding at his colleagues, he couldn't shake the weight pressing against his thoughts. The previous night hadn't ended for him. It had simply carried over into this new day, dragging with it the memory of her. Gaze, steady, certain. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something unfamiliar curling in his chest, a quiet, unrelenting sense of unease. Daniel sat at his desk, his posture the same as always, straight-backed, composed, the image of control. But inside, something gnawed at him, an unrelenting restlessness he couldn't quite name. He tried to focus, flipping through the reports left behind by the previous shift, forcing himself to absorb the details. But no matter how hard he tried, his mind kept circling back to her, to the way she had met his gaze with unwavering defiance, to the quiet strength in her voice, to the way she had refused, without so much as raising her tone, to be anything less than his equal. His jaw tightened as the memory twisted inside him, but before he could chase the thought further, a deep, firm voice cut through the haze behind him. "Stone, my office. Now." Daniel looked up sharply. Captain Marcus Lee, the new boss. Lee had taken command recently, and though Daniel hadn't had much direct interaction with him yet, he'd already heard plenty. A man of strict principles, a leader with an unshakable reputation for fairness. The kind of officer who upheld order, not just the appearance of it, but the true, unyielding kind. Lee's expression gave nothing away, but something in his tone sent an uneasy current through Daniel's veins. His pulse kicked up a notch as he rose from his chair and followed the captain toward his office, trying to keep his stride steady. He didn't know what this was about, not exactly, but a sick, sinking feeling in his gut whispered that it had everything to do with her. When he stepped inside, Lee was already seated behind his heavy wooden desk, his sharp eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "Close the door." Daniel hesitated for half a second before obeying. The click of the latch falling into place echoed in the silence between them, stretching the moment into something thick and suffocating. He stood rigid, waiting, his hands at his sides, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Finally, Lee spoke, his voice measured, calm, but carrying a weight that left no room for doubt. "Yesterday, you pulled over a luxury vehicle in Pine Hills. That's correct, isn't it?" Daniel swallowed, keeping his face neutral. "Yes, sir. Routine stop." Lee's head tilted slightly. Routine? The word rolled off his tongue like it was being tested. "And what exactly made you believe the driver was worth stopping?" Daniel felt the weight in his chest press deeper. He knew there hadn't been a real reason, nothing concrete, nothing beyond his own assumptions. But he couldn't say that. So he fell back on the same justification he had used before, his voice even. "The car was slightly over the speed limit, sir. Given the time and location, I believed it was worth checking out." Lee remained still for a long moment, his dark eyes studying Daniel as if peeling away layers, searching for whatever lay beneath. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Interesting," he mused, "because according to the driver's report, there was no infraction, and the stop itself was marked by comments that, let's just say, don't align with the standards I expect from my officers." A cold, sharp wave rushed through Daniel's veins, his fingers curled slightly at his sides. A complaint. Already. For it to reach the captain's desk this quickly meant it had been taken seriously. "With all due respect, sir," Daniel started, but Lee lifted a hand, silencing him instantly. "I'm not finished." His voice was still calm, but it was the kind of calm that carried the force of an oncoming storm. "Listen carefully, Stone." Lee's gaze hardened, his words deliberate. "I don't tolerate abuse of power in this department. I understand the job is demanding. I understand mistakes happen. But there are limits, and you crossed one." A sharp, pulsing panic coiled inside Daniel's chest, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "Sir, I only meant to ensure the safety of the community," he said, his voice steady, even as his insides twisted. "That was my intention. Nothing more." Lee studied him for another long moment before standing and moving toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out over the city. When he spoke again, his tone was quieter, but no less firm. "I hope that's true, because from this point forward, I'll be watching you, Stone, closely. This city needs officers who serve and protect, not those who intimidate and harass. There won't be a second chance." The words landed like a hammer against Daniel's ribs, each syllable heavy with unspoken consequences. He knew, in that moment, that he was being watched, that every move he made, every stop, every interaction, everything would be under scrutiny. A minefield had just been laid at his feet. One wrong step, and everything could detonate. He forced himself to nod, his throat dry. "Understood, sir." "Good." Lee didn't turn around. "Dismissed!" Daniel pivoted sharply, stepping out of the office with rigid control. But as he made his way back to his desk, the weight of Lee's warning pressed heavier against his spine. The sense of surveillance was immediate. Over the following days, it became clear that Lee's promise wasn't empty. His stops were suddenly observed more often, his reports scrutinized in ways they hadn't been before. He could feel the watchful eyes tracking his every move. And beneath it all, that feeling of unease still lingered. It wasn't just about being monitored. It wasn't just the looming threat of discipline or the risk of losing control. It was her. The memory of the woman refused to fade. The way she had looked at him, unshaken, unafraid. The way she had forced him to see himself in a way he didn't want to. And somewhere, buried beneath the layers of frustration and resentment, was a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. She had rattled him, not by screaming, not by resisting, not by fighting, but by refusing to be intimidated. And that more than anything made his blood run cold. At home, things weren't any better. Sarah barely spoke to him. Their conversations were short, mechanical, stripped of warmth. They had long settled into a distant rhythm, an unspoken agreement to coexist rather than connect. But tonight, that silence felt heavier than before. Daniel sat in the dim light of their living room, staring at nothing, thoughts racing. For the first time in years, he felt trapped. And for the first time ever, he wasn't sure how to fight his way out. Daniel had no desire to speak, and Sarah, in turn, seemed indifferent to the storm raging inside him. He often wondered if she knew about his affair with Claire, the wife of his colleague, but he never summoned the courage to ask. What had once felt like an exhilarating escape now only added to the crushing weight of his conscience. At the station, time dragged, each day more suffocating than the last. Daniel walked on eggshells, painfully aware of the scrutiny he was under. He forced himself to maintain a flawless record, but the relentless paranoia gnawed at him. Every glance from a colleague felt like an accusation. Every report he filed felt like a test. It was only a matter of time before Captain Lee made his move. And as the walls closed in, Daniel started to consider the one option he had never allowed himself before: walking away. Leaving the city, the department, his entire life behind. But escaping required courage, and he wasn't sure he had any left. The sun dipped behind the city's towering skyline, painting the streets in amber and gold, but Daniel found no solace in the beauty of the evening. Since his meeting with Captain Lee, a thick, oppressive cloud had settled over him, refusing to lift. Every action, every word, had to be calculated. One misstep, and everything could collapse. But there was another secret that tormented him, one he tried to suppress, even as it clawed at the edges of his sanity: his affair with Claire. What had once been an intoxicating, reckless indulgence had soured into a source of anxiety. The risk was too high, the consequences too dire. Yet, despite his better judgment, he couldn't stay away. That evening after his shift, Daniel received a message from Claire. She wanted to meet at their usual place, a discreet hotel on the outskirts of town. His gut told him to refuse, to sever this dangerous connection before it ruined him. But the need for escape, however fleeting, overpowered his reason. He convinced himself he could be careful, that he could outmaneuver fate. When he arrived, Claire was already waiting. She sat on the edge of the bed, her expression a mix of longing and apprehension. "You took your time," she murmured as he closed the door behind him. "For a moment, I thought you changed your mind." Daniel forced a smile, but it barely reached his eyes. "Things are complicated," he admitted, sitting beside her. "I'm being watched closely. We need to be more careful." Claire sighed, resting her head against his shoulder. "I know. I've been thinking about it a lot. But I can't stay away from you." Her words, which once would have thrilled him, now sent a fresh wave of anxiety through his veins. Their affair was no longer a secret tryst in the shadows. It was a ticking bomb. "And your husband?" Daniel asked, avoiding her gaze. "He's too wrapped up in work to notice," she replied with a humorless laugh. "I barely exist to him." Daniel felt an invisible hand tighten around his throat. He had told himself that what they had was harmless, that it didn't mean anything. But now, as he looked at Claire, he saw something in her eyes that he had overlooked before: uncertainty, perhaps even desperation. "We have to be smarter," he said, trying to inject a sense of control into his voice. "If anyone finds out, my career is over. I can't let that happen." Claire searched his face, her fingers ghosting over his wrist. "I don't want to cause you any trouble, Daniel, but I don't want to lose you either." "We'll keep going, but we'll be more careful," he replied, though the words felt empty. He wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, her or himself. In that moment, he believed he could still steer the situation, that he could remain undetected. But what he didn't know was that Captain Lee was already ahead of him. The next morning, the station was wrapped in an unspoken tension. Daniel felt it the moment he stepped inside. Colleagues exchanged glances that were just a little too sharp. Whispers followed in his wake. The air was thick with anticipation, as if they were all waiting for something inevitable to unfold. When he reached his desk, he found a plain white envelope waiting for him. No markings, no name. A chill crept up his spine as he picked it up, his fingers suddenly unsteady. Slowly, he tore it open, dread pooling in his stomach. Inside was a single photograph, his breath hitched, his pulse hammering in his ears. And in that moment, Daniel Stone knew his world was about to collapse. Daniel stared at the photograph in his trembling hands, his breath catching in his throat. It was unmistakable, he and Claire, together, entering the hotel. The world tilted for a moment, a dizzying realization gripping him. Someone knew. Someone had seen. The noose tightening around his neck had just cinched tighter. His gaze darted around the precinct, searching for a face that might give away the sender of this silent threat. But no one looked his way. His colleagues were engrossed in their tasks, oblivious to the storm raging within him. With a deliberate shaking motion, he slipped the photo back into the envelope and shoved it deep into his desk drawer, as though hiding it could make it disappear from reality. He needed to think. He needed to find a way out. The shrill ring of his desk phone shattered his fragile composure. He snatched it up, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Stone, my office, now." Captain Lee's voice was like steel, cold, unyielding. Daniel's blood turned to ice. He had known this moment would come, but not so soon. Each step toward Lee's office felt like wading through quicksand, the weight of his impending reckoning growing heavier with every inch. His pulse pounded in his ears and sweat beaded at his brow as he reached for the door handle. Inside, Lee stood behind his desk, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. On the polished surface before him lay the envelope, its contents partially visible. The damning image stared up at Daniel, an unspoken accusation that sent a fresh wave of panic surging through him. "Close the door." Lee's tone left no room for disobedience. Daniel obeyed, his throat dry as sandpaper. "I told you there wouldn't be a second chance, Stone." Lee's voice was eerily calm, a controlled force of nature just waiting to be unleashed. "I expected you to take that seriously." Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came. He felt like an animal trapped in a hunter's sights, every possible escape route blocked. Lee lifted the photo, his eyes scanning it with feigned detachment. "I knew something was off about you," he mused. "Your behavior at work was already questionable, but this?" His voice darkened, sharp as a blade. "This is a whole new level of disgrace." Daniel swallowed hard. "Captain, Explain?" Lee cut him off, stepping around the desk, his presence looming. "What exactly do you plan to explain? That you betrayed a fellow officer? That you jeopardized your position, your integrity, your entire damn career for what? A fling?" His voice was razor-edged, every word laced with contempt. Daniel's knees nearly buckled under the pressure. "It was a mistake," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It won't happen again." Lee's eyes bore into him, his scrutiny so intense that Daniel had to fight the urge to look away. Then, unexpectedly, the captain took a step back, tilting his head slightly as though considering something. "A mistake," he repeated, voice quieter now, more deliberate. "A mistake that could ruin you, ruin everyone around you." The silence stretched, thick with tension, before Lee exhaled and turned his gaze toward the window. "I could end your career right now," he murmured, almost as if he were weighing the decision aloud. "I could destroy everything you have left." Daniel's heart pounded like a war drum. "But," Lee continued, turning back to face him, "I'm going to give you a choice." A cold dread settled in Daniel's stomach. "You're going to redeem yourself, Stone." Lee's voice was a decree. "You will do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, and if you do it right, maybe, just maybe, you'll walk away from this with something resembling dignity." The walls of the office seemed to close in on Daniel, suffocating him with the weight of an ultimatum he had no power to refuse. "Yes, sir," he choked out, the words burning as they left his lips. Lee studied him for another beat before nodding. "Good. Now get out of my sight." Daniel left the office as if escaping a death sentence, but he knew the truth. He was more trapped now than ever. The days that followed were excruciatingly slow, each one thick with tension. He carried the burden of his secret like a heavy chain, the pressure mounting as Lee's watchful gaze remained fixed upon him. Every interaction with his colleagues felt like a test, every report scrutinized with unnerving precision. The walls were closing in, and Daniel had nowhere to run. Even home was no longer a refuge. The silence he had once appreciated had become oppressive, a constant reminder of the distance between him and Sarah. And Claire, what had once been an exhilarating escape, was now a ticking time bomb. Every glance they exchanged carried the weight of impending catastrophe. A week later, Lee summoned him again. This time, his expression was even graver. "I have a mission for you," he said without preamble. "A chance to prove whether you deserve this second chance I've given you." Daniel's pulse quickened. A mission. "We're investigating a drug trafficking ring," Lee continued, his gaze never wavering. "They've got someone on the inside, someone within our department. I need you to infiltrate them, earn their trust, and bring me the evidence we need." The words hit Daniel like a brick. Undercover work. Dangerous. Deadly. He was being sent straight into the lion's den. "Agent Tom Carter is already embedded," Lee went on. "He'll bring you in as a new recruit." Tom Carter, a hard-nosed narcotics officer known for his sharp instincts and zero-tolerance approach. Daniel had never worked with him directly, but he had heard enough to know Carter didn't trust easily. Daniel hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. "Understood, sir." Lee held his gaze for a moment longer before dismissing him. That night, Daniel met Carter in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city. The place reeked of stale beer and quiet deals being made in the shadows. Carter sat at the counter, barely acknowledging Daniel as he slid onto the stool beside him. "So you're the new guy," Carter muttered, taking a sip of his drink. "Looks like it," Daniel replied, keeping his tone neutral. Carter turned slightly, finally meeting his eyes. "Lee trusts you, so I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. But don't think that means I do." Daniel nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. "We meet the players tomorrow," Carter continued. "You keep your mouth shut and follow my lead. You screw this up and we both go down." Daniel swallowed hard. "I won't screw up." Carter smirked slightly before finishing his drink. "We'll see." The next morning, as Daniel sat at his desk, pretending to focus on reports, all he could think about was what lay ahead. He was stepping into a world where one misstep could mean his death. And yet, he knew. There was no turning back now. Daniel knew that failure didn't just mean the end of his career, it could mean the end of his life. The weight of that realization pressed against his chest like an iron hand, making it difficult to breathe. By the time night fell, his nerves were razor sharp, but he forced himself to maintain control. He met Carter at a desolate, abandoned lot on the outskirts of the city, where the only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustling of wind through the dead grass. The darkness stretched endlessly around them, suffocating and absolute, as though the world had forgotten this place existed. Carter wasn't alone. Two other men stood beside him, their presence heavy with an unspoken menace. Daniel had never seen them before, but he didn't need introductions to know what kind of men they were. Their eyes held the hardness of those who had long abandoned conscience, men who had seen things, done things, and lived to tell about it. One of them, a broad, thick-set man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, fixed Daniel with an expression of pure distrust. "This the guy?" the man asked, crossing his arms, his voice dripping with skepticism. Carter nodded once. "Yeah, this is Stone. He's solid." The man with the scar didn't seem convinced. His cold, assessing gaze lingered on Daniel, sizing him up as though searching for a crack in his facade. Then, after a long pause, he smirked, a slow, humorless expression that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "Well," he said, voice low and deliberate, "we'll see about that." Daniel remained motionless, his face unreadable, though his pulse hammered beneath his skin. "There's a shipment coming in tomorrow," the man continued. "We need someone to make sure everything goes smooth, no screw-ups." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can handle that?" Daniel didn't blink. His voice, when it came, was steady. "Yeah, I can handle it." The man studied him for another beat, then gave a slow, approving nod. "Good." But there was no warmth in it, only warning. As the night stretched on, Daniel followed Carter's lead, carefully studying every movement, every interaction, absorbing the rhythms of this world he was now trapped in. He knew that any misstep, any hesitation, could be fatal. His job wasn't just to gather information. It was to convince these men that he belonged, that he wasn't a threat. But as the days passed, he began to grasp the full scope of what he had stepped into. The network wasn't just a small-time operation. It was intricate, deep-rooted, reaching into places even the police hadn't fully uncovered. There were officers involved, yes, but there were also forces outside the law, people with power that stretched far beyond the station. And now Daniel was entangled in their web, caught between loyalty to the mission and the desperate need to keep himself alive. Then one evening, the man with the scar approached him again. This time his expression was darker, more scrutinizing. "You know something, Stone?" His voice was quieter now, almost casual, but laced with something dangerous. "I don't trust you." Daniel felt the hairs on his arms rise, but he didn't let it show. He met the man's gaze evenly. "I'm here to do the job," he said, his tone unwavering. The man held his stare for an agonizing moment, searching for weakness. Then, finally, he leaned back slightly, though suspicion still burned in his eyes. "I hope so," he murmured. "For your sake." Daniel knew what that meant. He was being watched, and if he wasn't careful, he was a dead man. At home, the strain of the mission bled into every part of his life. Sarah had grown distant, her silences stretching longer, her presence barely more than a shadow in their shared space. Their marriage, already frayed, now felt like it was disintegrating before his eyes. But there was no time to fix it, no energy left to try. Every moment, every breath was consumed by survival. Then, one morning, just as Daniel was preparing for another meeting with the network, his phone vibrated. A message from Lee. "We need to talk." Now. The word sent a cold shiver through his spine. Lee rarely summoned him like this, which meant something had changed, something big. Daniel drove to the station with his stomach knotted, his mind racing. When he entered Lee's office, he found the captain standing near the window, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. Daniel swallowed hard. "Captain," Lee cut him off with a sharp gesture. "We have a problem." He didn't turn around immediately. He let the words hang in the air, thick and heavy. Finally he turned, his gaze locking onto Daniel's, like a vice. "That man with the scar, Jake," Lee said, his voice dangerously calm. "He doesn't trust you." A pause, then lower. "And frankly, I don't blame him. Daniel felt his stomach drop. The noose was tightening, and he was running out of time. Daniel felt the blood in his veins turn to ice. He had known that Jake was suspicious, had sensed the man's quiet, watchful hostility, but hearing it confirmed by Lee made it real in a way that sent a cold dread creeping up his spine. Lee's voice was steady but edged with something grave, something that told Daniel the danger had escalated to a point of no return. "Jake's pushing," Lee continued, finally turning to face him. His expression was as impenetrable as stone, but the weight in his eyes spoke volumes. "He wants you to prove your loyalty, and the way he wants you to do it." Lee hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to make Daniel's stomach churn. "Is something we can't allow." Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "What does he want me to do?" "They've got a job lined up for tonight," Lee said, "and Jake's going to demand that you take part in it. If you refuse, you're done. They'll know you're a fraud, and you won't get out of there alive. But if you go through with it, you'll be in the middle of something that could blow this entire case apart. You'll be putting yourself, and everyone else, at extreme risk." It felt as if the ground beneath Daniel's feet had vanished. A free fall into uncertainty, into something that had only one possible outcome: disaster. He forced himself to swallow the rising fear and met Lee's gaze. "And what do you suggest I do?" he asked, willing his voice to remain steady. Lee stepped closer, his expression dark with the weight of what he was about to say. "We need a way out, Stone. You're going to take part in the job. But we'll be there. We'll be watching, waiting for the right moment to move in. This has to look real. You have to play the part until the very last second." Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind racing. The thought of actively participating in a heist, even under surveillance, made his stomach twist painfully. This wasn't what he had signed up for. One mistake, one misstep, and it wouldn't matter that the police were nearby. He'd be dead before they could reach him. But there was no alternative. He nodded, the decision made, even as doubt gnawed at him. "Understood. I'll do what needs to be done." Lee held his gaze for a long moment, as if searching for any hesitation, any sign of weakness. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "Stone, I know you've made a lot of mistakes, but this is your chance to set things right." His voice was lower now, tinged with something Daniel almost mistook for concern. "If you succeed, you walk away with your career intact. If you fail—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Daniel turned and walked out of the office, feeling as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. Time seemed to accelerate, pulling him forward like a force he couldn't resist. Night fell too quickly, swallowing him whole, and before he knew it, he was standing at the meeting point, staring into the abyss of what could very well be his final night alive. The abandoned warehouse loomed like a graveyard of rusted metal and shadows, the skeletal remains of forgotten industry stretching out beneath the cold glow of flickering streetlights. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the kind of silence that always came before something terrible happened. Jake stood at the center of it all, his scarred face barely illuminated in the dim light. The moment Daniel arrived, those cold, calculating eyes locked onto him. "Tonight," Jake said, his voice smooth but lethal, "we'll see what you're really made of." A slow, predatory smirk curled his lips as he tossed something toward Daniel. A gun. Daniel caught it, the cold steel settling into his palm like a weight far heavier than its physical form. Jake went on, explaining the plan. A hit on a rival cartel's drug depot. A high-risk operation that promised both danger and fortune. The kind of job that separated the weak from the worthy. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable, even as his pulse hammered against his ribs. Carter was there too, lingering in the background, his face shadowed with something unreadable. When their eyes met, no words were exchanged, but Daniel understood the silent message. This is a dangerous game. Play it well, or you won't live to regret it. As the group made final preparations, Daniel gripped the gun tighter, reminding himself to breathe. Every choice, every move he made tonight would determine not just his future, but his survival. When they arrived at the depot, the place was eerily silent. Too silent, the kind of quiet that set every nerve on edge. Jake led the way, moving with the precision of a man who had done this before, many times. Every movement was deliberate, every step calculated. Then a sound, distant, subtle, but unmistakable. The kind of sound that made experienced criminals freeze in place. Daniel knew instantly. The police were here. Lee had kept his word. The operation was being watched, but before relief could set in, he felt the shift in the air, the sudden dangerous shift of suspicion. Jake turned, his expression darkening, his entire body tensing with something deadly. His eyes locked onto Daniel, burning with accusation. "You set us up, didn't you?" His voice was low, almost a growl, but the weight of those words felt like a gun pressed to Daniel's temple. For a moment, everything slowed. Daniel knew that one wrong word, one wrong move, would be the end. He raised his hand slightly, trying to keep his voice steady. "This isn't part of the plan," he said, forcing as much conviction as he could into the words. Jake wasn't convinced. His gun came up, aimed directly at Daniel's head, and then a shot. Jake staggered, his body jerking as Carter took him down before he could pull the trigger. The warehouse exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted, shouts rang through the air, and then, suddenly, the police were everywhere. The takedown was swift, violent, absolute. Daniel hit the ground, his heart slamming against his ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The world spun around him as shouts and gunfire faded into silence. And then, through the haze, he saw Lee stepping into the aftermath, his eyes sweeping over the wreckage with a cold, assessing gaze. Jake was on the ground, unconscious, handcuffed. The other gang members were being hauled away. Carter extended a hand, pulling Daniel up. "You good?" he asked, his voice rough with both concern and exhaustion. Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. Lee approached, his expression unreadable. "You did it," he said. There was no praise in his tone, no triumph, just fact, just the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "It's over." But Daniel knew better. It wasn't over. Not for him. The mission was complete. But something inside him had been altered, cracked in a way that could never be repaired. Later, back at the station, Lee called him into his office one last time. The room was dimly lit, and for the first time Daniel saw the exhaustion in his captain's eyes. "You did what had to be done, Stone," Lee said. "Because of that, I'm giving you another chance." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "But make no mistake, this is your last one." Daniel nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. He had survived. He had salvaged his career. But as he walked away, head heavy, body drained, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something far greater. At home, Sarah was waiting, her face unreadable. There would be more battles ahead, more ghosts that would follow him. But for tonight, he just wanted silence. A moment to breathe. Before the consequences of everything he had done finally caught up with him.